Did you know a queen kept her country independent by staying single? Or that some women in old times chose a life without marriage to help change the world? What if not getting married was a way to fight for your beliefs, or even lead a nation against invaders? We often think of history through big battles and famous kings, but sometimes the most personal choice to marry or not became a huge political deal. Get ready to see how staying single was not just a personal choice, but a powerful statement that echoed through time, shaping kingdoms, inspiring movements, and challenging the way people thought. These stories show how sometimes not walking down the aisle was the most radical thing a person could do. Number 12. Nuns who said no to a new world. Imagine a time when the whole world around you was changing its most basic rules. This was Europe in the 1500s, during a period called the Reformation. For centuries, the Catholic Church had been the main religious power. One of its traditions was that priests, monks, and nuns lived celibate lives, meaning they did not marry or have romantic partners. Nuns lived in communities called convents, dedicating their lives to prayer work, and often education or caring for the sick. For many women, the convent was a place of spiritual devotion, but also a place of learning, community, and influence, away from the demands of marriage and childbearing. Then came leaders like Martin Luther in Germany and King Henry VIII in England. They challenged the Catholic Church's authority and started new forms of Christianity, known as Protestantism. These new branches of Christianity had different ideas about many things, including marriage. They often saw marriage as a good and holy state for everyone, including religious leaders. They did not believe in the special status of celibacy that the Catholic Church promoted. In fact, they often saw convents and monasteries as unnecessary or even corrupt. So, what happened to the nuns when these new ideas swept through their lands? In many places, rulers who adopted Protestantism decided to close down the convents and monasteries. The land and wealth of these religious houses were often taken by the state or given to nobles. Nuns were told to leave their homes, give up their vows, and return to ordinary life. They were often encouraged, or even pressured, to marry. For a woman who had dedicated her entire life to God in a celibate community, this was a massive upheaval. It was not just a change of address. It was a challenge to her deepest beliefs, her identity, and her way of life. For some nuns, this was a terrifying prospect. They faced losing their homes, their spiritual family, and the life they had chosen. The outside world could be unwelcoming, especially for women who had little experience outside the convent walls and might not have families willing or able to take them back. The pressure to marry might have felt like a betrayal of their sacred promises to God. So, some of them resisted. This resistance was a powerful political statement. In a world where kings and princes were dictating new religious laws, for a group of women to say no was a brave act. It was a statement that their loyalty to their faith and their vows was more important than the orders of the new rulers. Caritas Pirkheimer, for example, was the abbess of a convent in Nuremberg, Germany. When the city council tried to dissolve her convent and forced the nuns to abandon their ways, Caritas wrote letters, argued, and used her education and connections to defend her community. She and her sisters insisted on their right to live according to their conscience and their Catholic faith. They saw the efforts to make them marry as an attack on their spiritual freedom. Their continued commitment to celibacy and communal religious life became a visible symbol of opposition to the Reformation in those areas. It was a quiet but firm declaration that the new religious authorities did not control every aspect of their lives, especially their spiritual choices. By choosing to remain unmarried and loyal to their vows, these nuns were not just making a personal religious choice. They were standing against the tide of political and religious change being imposed from above. They were asserting that their spiritual path had value and that the female communities they had built were important. Their singleness in this context was a direct challenge to the new order, which often emphasized marriage as the ideal path for women and sought to dismantle the institutions that allowed women to live independently of it in a religious context. Their struggle highlighted the political implications of religious reform, showing how deeply it affected individual lives and how even seemingly powerless groups could make their voices heard through their steadfastness. The act of remaining a nun, unmarried, and dedicated to a Catholic way of life became an act of political defiance in a rapidly changing world. Number 11. Sweden's queen who walked away from the crown and marriage. Imagine being born to rule a powerful kingdom, with everyone expecting you to marry a prince and have children to continue the royal line. Now, imagine choosing a completely different path, one that shocked your country and all of Europe. This is the story of Christina, Queen of Sweden, who reigned in the 1600s. She was not just any queen. She was a highly intelligent and unconventional ruler who made choices that were deeply personal and massively political. Christina became queen when she was just 6 years old, after her father, King Gustavus Adolphus, died in battle. Because she was so young, a council of advisors ruled for her, but they also made sure she received an education fit for a king, not just a princess. She studied languages, philosophy, history, and science, and she was brilliant. She loved learning and surrounded herself with scholars and artists. As she grew up, everyone, from her own council to foreign powers, assumed she would marry. Marriage for a queen was not just about love. It was a crucial political tool. It could create alliances, secure peace, and most importantly, produce an heir to the throne, ensuring stability for the kingdom. The pressure on Christina to marry was immense. Suitors were proposed from various royal houses of Europe. Each potential marriage carried huge political weight. Marrying one prince might anger another nation. Her council urged her to choose anyone suitable, to secure Sweden's future. But Christina was different. She valued her independence and her intellectual pursuits more than the idea of a traditional royal marriage. She famously said she would rather die than marry, and sometimes hinted that she found the idea of marriage and childbearing distasteful for herself personally. For years, she skillfully avoided committing to any suitor, using the ongoing negotiations as a diplomatic game, much like Queen Elizabeth I of England had done. Her refusal to marry was, in itself, a political statement. It signaled that she was not going to follow the expected path for a female ruler. It kept Sweden free from the influence of a foreign consort, but it also created uncertainty about the succession. Who would rule after her if she had no children? This was a constant worry for her advisors and her people. But Christina had even bigger surprises in store. While she was queen, she became increasingly interested in Catholicism. This was a huge problem, because Sweden was a staunchly Protestant country. Her father had been a champion of the Protestant cause in Europe. For the Swedish queen to even consider Catholicism was unthinkable. A political betrayal? Yet, Christina secretly explored this fate. Then, in 1654, at the age of 28, Christina did something truly astounding. She abdicated the throne. She gave up her crown, her country, and her power. Her reason: she wanted to be free to convert to Catholicism openly, something she could not do as the Queen of Protestant Sweden. She named her cousin Charles as her successor, thus solving the succession crisis her singleness had prolonged, but in the most unexpected way. Her abdication sent shockwaves across Europe. Why would a young, powerful queen willingly give up everything? Christina's journey did not end there. After leaving Sweden, she traveled through Europe and eventually settled in Rome, the heart of the Catholic world. She officially converted to Catholicism and lived there as a celebrated, independent, and still unmarried woman. She became a major figure in Rome's cultural life, a patron of art, music, and theater. She hosted salons where intellectuals gathered. She never married. She had chosen a life of intellectual and religious freedom over royal duty and dynastic marriage. Her decision to remain single throughout her life, combined with her abdication and conversion, was a series of bold political statements. She was stating that her personal convictions and her desire for intellectual and spiritual autonomy were more important than the traditional expectations placed on a monarch, especially a female one. She challenged the idea that a woman's primary role was to marry and produce heirs, even if that woman was a queen. Her life demonstrated a radical form of personal sovereignty, a declaration that she, and perhaps by extension, other women could define their own paths, even if it meant defying the political and religious norms of an entire continent. Her story is a testament to a woman who used her unique position, not just to rule, but to make profound statements about freedom, faith, and the right to choose one's own destiny regardless of marital status. Number 10. The spirit medium who rallied a nation without a husband by her side. In the late 1800s, vast parts of Africa were being carved up and claimed by European powers. In what is now Zimbabwe, the British South Africa Company, led by Cecil Rhodes, was extending its control, dispossessing the Shona and Nebale peoples of their land and imposing colonial rule. In this challenging time, a powerful figure emerged to inspire resistance, a woman named Charnyakasikana, better known as Shembaya Nahanda, or Ambuya Nihanda. Baya means grandmother in Shona, a title of respect. She was a spirit medium, and her singleness or detachment from ordinary family life was intertwined with her immense spiritual and political authority. In Shona culture, spirit mediums play a vital role. They are individuals believed to be chosen by powerful ancestral spirits to communicate messages from the spiritual world to the living. These spirits can offer guidance, warnings, and wisdom. Nahanda was one of the most revered spirits in Shona cosmology, associated with fertility, rain, and protection. Charnyakasikana was the medium for this powerful Nihanda spirit. To become a medium for such an important spirit often required a life set apart. While not all mediums were strictly celibate for their entire lives, during the periods when they were actively channeling the spirit, or for particularly powerful mediums, a degree of separation from ordinary domestic life, including potentially marriage or spousal intimacy, was often expected or observed to maintain spiritual purity and focus. This separation could enhance their spiritual authority, as they were seen as being wholly dedicated to the spirit world and the community, rather than to a single family unit. When the British settlers and their forces began to assert dominance, taking land, imposing taxes, and disrupting traditional ways of life, resentment grew among the Shona and Nebale people. Baya Nahanda, as the medium of a powerful ancestral spirit, became a central figure in encouraging resistance. She, along with other spiritual leaders, is credited with inspiring and helping to coordinate the First Chimarig, or First War of Liberation, against British colonial rule in 1896–1897. Her messages from the spirit world urged people to unite and fight to reclaim their land and freedom. She was seen as a voice of the ancestors, giving divine sanction to the uprising. Her spiritual authority translated directly into political influence and military leadership. She was not a queen or a chief, in the traditional sense, who might derive power from lineage or marriage alliances. Her power came from her connection to the spirit world, a connection that was often seen as being clearer and stronger because she was not primarily defined by a husband or conventional family ties. Her independent status as a spirit medium allowed her to transcend clan politics and appeal to a broader sense of Shona identity and purpose. Reports from the time describe her as a key leader, strategist, and source of inspiration for the warriors. She promised them spiritual protection and assured them of the righteousness of their cause. Her lack of a marital partner in a leadership role was not seen as a deficiency. Rather, her primary partnership was with the powerful spirit she channeled, which gave her an authority that many male political leaders respected and followed. In this context, her single status, or at least her non-conventional domestic status as a prominent medium, was part of what made her such a potent political figure. She was dedicated to the spirit and to her people, not to a single household. The first Chimerig was ultimately suppressed by the superior firepower of the British forces. Bayanihanda was captured in 1897. She was charged with murder for her role in the killing of a particularly brutal native commissioner, Henry Pollard, and for leading the rebellion. She refused to convert to Christianity, which might have lessened her sentence until the very end, according to some accounts. She was executed by hanging in 1898. Even in her death, her political statement continued. Her defiance and her sacrifice made her a potent symbol of resistance against colonial oppression. Her story, including her role as a spirit medium unconstrained by typical marital roles for women of the time, became a cornerstone of Zimbabwean nationalism. Decades later, during the Second Chimerig, in the 1960s and 1970s, which led to Zimbabwe's independence, the spirit of Mbawa Nehenda was invoked again to inspire freedom fighters. Her image as a powerful, spiritually guided, and independent female leader who put the needs of her nation before personal or familial concerns resonated deeply. Her singleness, or her primary dedication to her spiritual calling over conventional marriage, was intrinsically linked to her political power and her enduring legacy as a national hero. Number 9. Of Thinker of Alexandria, who lived for knowledge, not marriage. Picture the ancient city of Alexandria in Egypt, around the year 400. It was a bustling center of learning, home to the famous Great Library and a place where Greek, Egyptian, and Jewish cultures mixed. In this vibrant city lived a woman named Hypatia. She was a philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer, a brilliant teacher who attracted students from all over the Roman Empire. And in a society where women, especially those of her social standing, were generally expected to marry and manage households, Hypatia remained unmarried, dedicating her life to scholarship and teaching. This choice was not just personal. It became part of her public identity, and ultimately may have contributed to her tragic end in a highly charged political environment. Hypatia was the daughter of Theon, a respected mathematician and astronomer, who was also her teacher. He recognized her exceptional intellect and educated her thoroughly in subjects usually reserved for men. She quickly surpassed many of her contemporaries, gaining a reputation for her wisdom and eloquence. She taught from her home and possibly in public lecture halls, explaining the complex philosophical ideas of Plato and Aristotle, and delving into advanced mathematics and astronomy. She was known for her clear explanations and her engaging teaching style. Importantly, she was a Neoplatonist philosopher, part of a school of thought that valued reason, intellectual inquiry, and the pursuit of higher knowledge. In the Alexandria of Hypatia's time, remaining unmarried for a woman devoted to intellectual pursuits was unusual, but not entirely unheard of in philosophical circles that sometimes valued detachment from worldly concerns. For Hypatia, her singleness seems to have been intertwined with her identity as a philosopher and teacher. It allowed her the time and freedom to dedicate herself fully to her studies. Her writing, though none of her works survived directly, and her students, It also meant she was not under the legal or social authority of a husband, giving her a degree of independence that was rare for women. Her students, who included influential figures, deeply respected her. She was seen as a figure of great moral virtue and intellectual prowess. However, Alexandria was also a city of intense political and religious tensions. The Roman Empire was transitioning towards Christianity as the dominant religion, and there were fierce conflicts between Christians, Jews, and followers of the older Greco-Roman pagan traditions, which included many philosophers like Hypatia. The city was often on the brink of violence, with different factions vying for power and influence. Christian Patriarch of Alexandria, Cyril, was a particularly aggressive figure, keen to assert Christian dominance over all aspects of city life, including intellectual and political. Hypatia, with her influential public role, her pagan philosophical leanings, and her close relationship with Orestes, the Roman prefect, governor of Alexandria, found herself caught in these dangerous currents. Orestes was a Christian, but he represented Roman imperial authority and was often in conflict with Cyril. Hypatia was known to advise Orestes, and her wisdom was valued in political circles. Her visible, respected position as an unmarried female intellectual, who was also a pagan in the eyes of some aggressive Christian factions, made her a target. Her singleness in this context might have made her seem even more unconventional and perhaps threatening to those who adhered to strict patriarchal views, where women were expected to be wives and mothers under male authority. An independent, highly intelligent woman who commanded public respect and advised political leaders, all while remaining outside the traditional structure of marriage, was an anomaly. In the year 415, tensions in Alexandria boiled over. A mob of Christian fanatics, reportedly incited by rumors that Hypatia was using her influence with Orestes to prevent a reconciliation between him and Cyril, attacked her. They dragged her from her chariot, took her to a church, and brutally murdered her. This horrific act was not just a random outburst of violence. It was a deeply political event. It was seen by many as an attack on philosophy, on learning, on the remaining pagan influences in the city, and on a powerful woman who did not fit neatly into the prescribed roles. Hypatia's choice to remain single was a personal one, likely driven by her dedication to her intellectual life. But in the volatile political landscape of Alexandria, her entire persona, the learned philosopher, the respected teacher, the advisor to the governor, and the unmarried woman, became a political statement. She represented a world of classical learning and female intellectual autonomy that was increasingly under threat. Her murder was a stark message about the changing power dynamics in the empire and the dangers faced by those who, like Hypatia, stood as symbols of an older order or a different way of being, especially if they were women who defied convention by choosing intellect and independence. Number 8. The Shakers who built a different kind of family without marriage. Imagine a group of people deciding to live together in a way that was completely different from everyone else around them. They shared all their property, believed men and women were equal in spirit, and most strikingly, they chose not to marry or have children. This was the reality for the Shakers, a religious group that flourished in America from the late 1700s through the 1800s. Their commitment to celibacy was not just a quirky rule. It was a core part of their political and social statement about how to create a more perfect heavenly society on earth. The Shakers, officially known as the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, began in England and were led by a woman named Anne Lee, Mother Anne, as her followers called her. And a small group of believers came to America in 1774, seeking religious freedom. They believed that Anne Lee embodied the second coming of Christ, this time in female form, fulfilling the idea of God having both male and female aspects. This belief in a dual, male-female godhead was radical for its time and informed their views on gender equality. Central to Shaker belief was the idea that to live a truly spiritual life, one had to renounce worldly ways, and the most fundamental of these was what they called the works of generation, marriage and sexual relations. They believed that the fall of Adam and Eve was rooted in lust, and that to achieve spiritual purity and build God's kingdom on earth, believers needed to live celibate lives. This was not a suggestion. It was a requirement for full members of Shaker communities. So, how did a community survive and even grow if no one was getting married or having children? Shaker communities grew by attracting converts, adults who were drawn to their message, their way of life, and the security their communities offered. They also took in orphans and children from families who could not care for them, raising them in the Shaker faith, though these children were free to leave when they became adults if they chose not to commit to celibacy. Shaker villages were highly organized and industrious. They were known for their simple, functional, and beautiful craftsmanship, especially their furniture, which is still admired today. They believed in hard work, equality, and communal living. Men and women lived in separate quarters within the same large dwelling houses, worked in traditionally gendered but equally valued roles, and shared in leadership positions. This was a stark contrast to the patriarchal society outside their villages, where women had far fewer rights and opportunities. Their commitment to celibacy was a profound political and social statement. In a society that viewed marriage and family as the bedrock of social order and economic stability, the Shakers created a successful and long-lasting alternative. They were saying that it was possible to live a fulfilling, orderly, and prosperous life without individual marriage and nuclear families. Their celibacy was a critique of what they saw as the possessiveness, inequality, and distractions of traditional family life, which they believed hindered spiritual growth and true Christian community. By choosing not to marry, Shakers were also making a statement about control over their own bodies and their relationships. For women, in particular, who in the outside world were often legally and economically dependent on their husbands and subject to the dangers of frequent childbirth, Shaker life offered a different model. It provided a community where they were spiritually equal, economically secure through the community's efforts, and free from the burdens and constraints of traditional marriage. Their way of life was so different that it naturally drew curiosity, suspicion, and sometimes hostility from the world's people, as they called outsiders. Their ecstatic form of worship, which involved shaking, singing, and dancing, hence the name Shakers, was also unconventional. But their pacifism, honesty in business, and the quality of their goods earned them respect. The Shaker choice of celibacy was a radical act of social experimentation and a lived political ideology. It challenged fundamental norms about family, gender, roles, property, ownership, and the purpose of life. They were demonstrating that a society could be organized around spiritual principles, communalism, and gender equality, with celibacy as a cornerstone of that vision. While the number of Shakers has dwindled significantly today, their historical communities stand as a powerful example of a group that made singleness a collective political statement about how to live a life dedicated to creating a heaven on earth in their own unique way. Number 7. The pure ones, who used singleness to challenge a powerful church. In the heart of medieval Europe, during the 11th to 13th centuries, a religious movement known as Catholicism took root, particularly in southern France. Cathars had beliefs that were very different from the mainstream Catholic Church, and one of their most striking features was a group of elite spiritual leaders called perfects, or good Christians. These perfects, both men and women, lived lives of extreme austerity and, crucially, strict celibacy. Their commitment to this unmarried ascetic lifestyle was not just a personal discipline, It was a direct and powerful political challenge to the wealthy, powerful, and often criticized Catholic clergy of the time. Cathars believed in two opposing principles: a good God who created the spiritual world, and an evil God or force who created the material world, including the human body. They saw the physical world as inherently corrupt and a trap for the soul. The goal of life was to free the soul from this material prison and return to the good spiritual realm. To achieve this, they advocated a life of simplicity, detachment from worldly goods, and a rejection of physical pleasures. Within the Catholic community, there were two main groups: the ordinary believers and the elite perfects. Believers lived relatively normal lives, but followed Cathar teachings. The perfects, however, underwent a special ceremony called the consolamentum, a kind of spiritual baptism. After this, they committed to a life of extreme rigor. They were strict vegetarians, often avoiding eggs, dairy, and anything that came from sexual reproduction. They fasted frequently, traveled constantly to preach and minister to believers, and they absolutely had to be celibate. They believed that procreation trapped more souls in the corrupt material world, so they rejected marriage and sexual relations for themselves entirely. This lifestyle of the perfects stood in stark contrast to the behavior of some members of the Catholic clergy at that time. The Catholic Church was immensely wealthy and politically powerful. Many bishops and priests lived like princes, accumulating riches, engaging in political maneuvering, and sometimes failing to live up to their own vows of celibacy, leading to accusations of corruption and hypocrisy. Ordinary people often saw this disconnect between the Church's ideals and the actions of its representatives. Cathar perfects, by their very existence, offered a compelling alternative. Here were spiritual leaders, men and women, living in poverty, dedicated to helping others, and adhering strictly to a life of purity and non-attachment, including being unmarried and chaste. Their followers saw them as truly holy people, living embodiments of their spiritual ideals. The fact that women could become perfects and hold positions of spiritual authority was also a significant departure from the male-dominated hierarchy of the Catholic Church, adding another layer to their challenge. The celibacy of the perfects was a key part of this political statement. It was a visible symbol of their rejection of worldly corruption and their commitment to a purely spiritual path. It made them seem more authentically religious to many people than the established clergy. This was deeply threatening to the Catholic Church because it undermined its authority and credibility. If people believed the Cathars offered a truer path to salvation, the Church stood to lose followers, influence, and income. The Church recognized this threat. Catharism was declared a heresy, a belief system that contradicted official Church doctrine. Pope launched preaching missions to try to convert the Cathars back to Catholicism, but these had little success. The simple, austere lives of the perfects, including their unwavering celibacy, often made a more powerful impression on the populace than the arguments of the Church's envoys. Ultimately, the challenge posed by the Cathars and their celibate perfects was met with brutal force. Pope initiated the Albigensian Crusade in the early 13th century, a 20-year war aimed at wiping out Catharism. Thousands of people, including many perfects and believers, were massacred. Inquisition was later established to root out any remaining heretics. Cathar perfects' choice of a celibate life was a fundamental tenet of their faith, but it also functioned as a potent political critique. It highlighted what many perceived as the moral failings of the established Church and offered a model of spiritual leadership based on purity, simplicity, and detachment from worldly power and physical desires. Their singleness was not just an absence of marriage. It was a core component of a radical religious and social movement that dared to challenge one of the most powerful institutions in the medieval world, and they paid a terrible price for that challenge. Number 6. The women who built their own world outside of marriage or convent. In medieval Europe, for many women, the main life paths seemed to be marriage or joining a convent as a nun. Both involved submitting to a certain kind of authority, either a husband's or the church's. But starting in the late 12th century, a new and remarkable movement emerged primarily in the Low Countries, modern-day Belgium and Netherlands, and Germany, the Beguines. These were women who chose to live devout religious lives in communities, but without taking formal lifelong vows like nuns. They often remained single, supporting themselves through their own labor, and they created a unique social and spiritual space for women that was a subtle but significant political statement about female autonomy and alternative ways of living. Beguines lived together in houses, often clustered together in walled communities called beguinages, which could be like small towns within a larger city. These were not convents in the traditional sense. Beguines did not take permanent vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience that nuns did. While they typically lived celibate lives during their time as beguines, they were in theory free to leave the beguinage and marry if they chose to, though many lived their entire lives within these communities. They also retained control over their own property, unlike nuns who renounced personal possessions. This flexibility was revolutionary. It offered women a third way, a life dedicated to religious piety and good works, but with more personal freedom and independence than was available in a convent, and without the constraints and obligations of marriage. Beguinages became havens for women from various social classes, widows, unmarried women, and even those who simply sought a spiritual life outside traditional structures. How did they support themselves? Beguines were incredibly industrious. They engaged in various trades, such as weaving, spinning, lace-making, caring for the sick, and teaching children. They formed guilds, managed their own finances, and ran their communities largely by themselves. This economic independence was crucial. It meant they were not reliant on male relatives or church endowments in the same way nuns often were. They built a functioning female-led socio-economic system. Their spirituality was often deeply personal and mystical. Many beguines were known for their intense devotional practices, their writings on spiritual experiences, and their charitable work. Figures like Hadewich of Antwerp and Mechthild of Magdeburg were beguines, whose mystical writings are still studied today for their profound insights and beautiful prose. They often wrote in their vernacular languages, like Middle Dutch or Middle High German, rather than Latin, making their ideas more accessible to lay people, another subtle challenge to the Church's Latin-dominated intellectual sphere. The existence of beguinages was a political statement in several ways. Firstly, it demonstrated that women could organize themselves, govern their own communities, and be economically self-sufficient without direct male oversight or formal church control. This challenged the prevailing patriarchal ideas that women needed to be guided and controlled by men, whether husbands or male clergy. Secondly, by choosing a life of active work and service in the world, combined with religious devotion and often celibacy, beguines offered an alternative model of female piety. It was different from the enclosed, contemplative life of many nuns, and very different from the domestic life of a wife and mother. They were religious women who were also active participants in urban economies and social care. Their independence, however, sometimes made church authorities nervous, because they were not under the strict rules of an established religious order, and because their spirituality could be intensely personal and sometimes unconventional. Beguines occasionally faced suspicion and accusations of heresy. Some prominent beguines, like Marguerite Porete, who wrote The Mirror of Simple Souls, were condemned and even executed for their views. Despite these pressures, the beguine movement thrived for centuries, with tens of thousands of women participating at its height. The choice of many Beguines to remain single or to live celibately within their communities was integral to this alternative model. It freed them from the demands of family life and allowed them to dedicate their time and energy to their spiritual pursuits, their work, and their community. It was a quiet but powerful assertion of female agency. The Beguines, through their collective way of life, carved out a space where women could live with dignity, purpose, and a significant degree of self-determination, making their largely unmarried communities a remarkable political and social statement in the medieval world. Number 5. The nurse who fought for change, choosing mission over marriage. Florence Nightingale is a name known around the world, famous as the Lady with the Lamp, who tended to wounded soldiers during the Crimean War in the 1850s. But she was much more than just a compassionate nurse. She was a brilliant statistician, a relentless reformer, and a woman who consciously chose her demanding public mission over the traditional path of marriage and family. Her decision to remain single was not a passive occurrence. It was a deliberate choice that enabled her to make monumental political statements and bring about sweeping changes in healthcare, hospital design, and sanitation, both in military and civilian life. Born into a wealthy British family, Florence was expected to marry well, manage a household, and live a life of social engagements. This was the standard path for women of her class in Victorian England. She received several marriage proposals from suitable men whom she found agreeable. However, Florence felt a strong calling from God to do significant work in the world, something beyond the confines of domestic life. She believed that marriage, with its expected duties of wife and mother, would make it impossible for her to pursue this calling. She famously wrote that she felt marriage would mean sacrificing her work, her independence, and her ability to dedicate herself fully to what she saw as her God-given mission. She struggled for years against her family's opposition to her desire to become a nurse. Nursing at that time was considered a low-status, disreputable job, not suitable for a lady of her standing. But Florence persisted, studying healthcare and visiting hospitals. Her opportunity to make a difference came with the Crimean War. Reports from the front described horrific conditions for wounded soldiers. Hospitals were filthy, overcrowded, and lacked basic supplies. More soldiers were dying from disease and infection than from their battle wounds. Florence Nightingale, with a team of nurses she recruited, went to the military hospital at Scutari. What she found was appalling. She set about organizing the hospital, improving sanitation, ensuring soldiers had clean bedding, food, and proper care. Her tireless work, often late into the night, hence the lamp, dramatically reduced the death rate. She was not just providing care, she was managing a complex operation and fighting against bureaucratic inertia and resistance from army officials. When she returned to England after the war, she was a national hero. But she did not rest on her laurels. She used her newfound fame and influence to push for massive reforms. This is where her choice to be single became a powerful political tool. Unencumbered by a husband or children, she could dedicate all her formidable energy, intellect, and time to her work. She was a master of collecting and analyzing data. She used statistics, a relatively new tool at the time, to demonstrate the impact of sanitation on health outcomes. Her Rose diagrams, imitative pie charts, vividly showed how many more soldiers died from preventable diseases than from combat. She became a powerful lobbyist, relentlessly pressuring government officials, military leaders, and policymakers to implement reforms. She wrote thousands of letters, reports, and books. She advised on hospital design, sanitation systems for cities, and healthcare for the poor in England and even in India. Much of this intense, demanding work she did from her home, often from her bed due to chronic illness, possibly brucellosis, contracted during the war, but her influence was far-reaching. Her unmarried status gave her a unique kind of authority and freedom. She was not seen as someone's wife, but as Florence Nightingale, the expert, the reformer. She could meet with powerful men, correspond with them, and challenge them in ways that might have been more difficult for a married woman of that era. She chose her work above all else. She once wrote that she had no atom of leisure, and that her life was one of perpetual head work. Florence Nightingale's decision to forego marriage was a profound personal sacrifice for her, as she did value companionship. But it was also a strategic choice that amplified her political impact. She was making a statement that a woman's life could be dedicated to public service and intellectual labor at the highest level. By remaining single, she maximized her capacity to fight for systemic change, to challenge entrenched interests, and to save countless lives through her reforms. Her legacy is not just in nursing, but in public health, hospital administration, and the use of data for social good, all driven by a woman who chose a singular path to fulfill a massive political and humanitarian mission. Number 4. The suffragist who knew marriage could wait, but freedom could not. I am sure that no man could have made me happier than I have been. These are not the words of a woman celebrating a joyful marriage, but of Susan B. Anthony, one of the most prominent leaders of the women's suffrage movement in the United States. She never married, and this was not by accident. For Susan B. Anthony, remaining single was a conscious decision, a practical necessity, and a powerful underlying statement that fueled her lifelong relentless fight for women's right to vote and other equalities. Her singleness allowed her the unwavering focus and tireless dedication needed to challenge a political system that largely excluded women. Born in 1820 into a Quaker family that believed in social reform and equality, Susan B. Anthony was instilled with a strong sense of justice from a young age. She began her activist career in the abolitionist and temperance movements, but soon realized that without the right to vote, without political power, women could not effectively bring about change in any area. She met Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1851, and thus began one of the most famous and productive partnerships in American history. Stanton, who was married and had 7 children, was often the writer and theorist of their team, while Anthony, the single woman, was the organizer, the traveler, the public speaker, and the one who faced down hostile crowds in relentless opposition. Susan B. Anthony understood the practical limitations that marriage and motherhood placed on women in the 19th century. Women had very few legal rights. Their property, earnings, and even their children were often legally controlled by their husbands. The demands of running a household and raising a family without modern conveniences were all-consuming. Anthony saw that for her to dedicate her entire life to the difficult, often thankless and poorly paid work of the suffrage movement, she needed to be free from these domestic responsibilities. She once said, "I have been in the legislative halls of almost every state in the Union. I have been before committees of Congress. I have been to national political conventions. How could I have done all this if I had a husband and a half-dozen children?" Her choice to remain single was therefore a strategic one. It allowed her to travel extensively across the country, year after year, giving speeches, organizing campaigns, gathering petitions, and building the suffrage movement from the ground up. She faced ridicule, insults, and even arrest for her activism. In 1872, she famously voted in the presidential election, arguing that the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, implicitly gave women the right to vote. She was arrested, tried, and convicted, though she refused to pay the fine. This act of civil disobedience was a powerful political statement in itself. Beyond the practicalities, her singleness also subtly underscored the message of female independence that was central to the suffrage cause. In an era when a woman's identity was largely defined by her husband and family, Susan B. Anthony stood as a powerful example of a woman who lived a full, purposeful, and influential life on her own terms. She was not anti-marriage for others, but she believed that women should not be forced into it for economic security or social acceptance. She wanted women to have choices, including the choice to remain single and pursue other vocations. Her dedication was absolute. She poured all her energy and resources into the cause. She published a newspaper, The Revolution, with Stanton, advocating for women's rights. She helped found national suffrage organizations and worked tirelessly to bring different factions of the movement together. She understood that achieving the vote was not just about casting a ballot, it was about women gaining full citizenship, recognition as individuals, and the power to shape the laws and society they lived in. Susan B. Anthony did not live to see the passage of the 19th Amendment in 11,920, which finally granted American women the right to vote. She died in 1906. But her decades of unwavering work, made possible in large part by her decision to remain single and dedicate her entire being to the cause, laid the essential groundwork for that victory. Her life was a testament to the idea that one person, through focused and relentless effort, can help change the world. Her singleness was not an absence of something, but a presence of something else, an unyielding commitment to a political ideal, the equality of all people. It was a political statement lived out every day for over half a century. Number 3. The sacred virgins who guarded Rome's flame and its fate. Imagine a group of women in ancient Rome whose virginity was not just a personal state but a matter of state security. These were the Vestal Virgins, priestesses of Vesta, the Roman goddess of the hearth, home, and family. For over 1,000 years, these women played a crucial and highly public role in Roman religious and political life. Their commitment to celibacy for a long period of service was considered vital for the safety and prosperity of Rome itself, making their singleness a profound state-sanctioned political statement. The Vestal Virgins were chosen as young girls, typically between the ages of 6 and 10, from patrician families. They took a vow of celibacy and dedicated themselves to serving the goddess Vesta for at least 30 years. Their primary and most sacred duty was to keep the sacred fire of Vesta burning continuously in her temple in the Roman Forum. This fire was believed to be directly linked to the continuation and well-being of Rome. If the fire went out, it was considered a terrible omen, signaling that Vesta had withdrawn her protection from the city, and the Vestal responsible could be severely punished. During their 30 years of service, Vestals lived in a special house near the temple, the Atrium Vestae. They were free from the usual social obligations of Roman women, such as parental control or the authority of a husband. They enjoyed unique privileges and honors. They could own property, make a will, and give evidence in court without taking an oath. They had special seats at public games and ceremonies. If they encountered a condemned criminal on his way to execution, they had the power to pardon him. Their very persons were considered sacrosanct, and injuring a Vestal Virgin was punishable by death. Their celibacy was the cornerstone of their sacred status and their political importance. It was believed that their purity was essential to maintaining the pact between Rome and the gods. A Vestal Virgin who broke her vow of chastity was accused of incestum, a grave religious crime that was thought to pollute the state and anger the gods, potentially bringing disaster upon Rome. The punishment for a Vestal found guilty of incestum was terrifying. She was buried alive in a specially constructed underground chamber with a small amount of food and water, left to die a slow death as her sacred blood could not be spilled. The man involved was flogged to death. These harsh punishments underscore how seriously Romans took the Vestal's vows. Trial of a Vestal Virgin was a major public and political event. Accusations could sometimes be politically motivated, used to discredit families or factions. The state, through its religious officials like the Pontifex Maximus, had a direct interest in ensuring the perceived purity of the Vestals, as this was tied to Rome's own security and divine favor. After completing their 30 years of service, Vestals were free to leave the priesthood and marry. Some did, though it was said that such marriages were often not happy, perhaps because these women were used to a life of high status and independence that was hard to repega in a traditional Roman marriage. Many chose to remain within the Vestal community, continuing to serve as respected elders. The institution of the Vestal Virgins was a powerful political statement about the role of women in religion in the state, albeit a very specific and constrained role. It showed that women, through their ritual purity and dedicated service, which included their mandated singleness for a significant portion of their lives, could hold positions of immense symbolic power and perform functions deemed essential for the survival and success of Rome. Their celibacy was not just a private religious observance. It was a public, political act, a guarantee of Rome's sacred contract with its gods. Their existence, their duties, and the severe consequences for breaking their vows all highlighted the profound intersection of religion, gender, and state power in ancient Rome. The sacred fire they tended was a symbol of Rome's life, and their dedicated singleness was the condition for keeping that flame and Rome's fortunes alive. Number 2. The maid, who led an army, her purity, her political banner. In the midst of the 100 Years' War, a bitter conflict between France and England, a teenage peasant girl emerged from obscurity, claiming to hear divine voices. Her name was Joan of Arc, or Jeanne d'Arc. She declared that God had given her a mission: to drive the English out of France and see the Dauphin, the uncrowned heir to the French throne, crowned as king. A crucial part of her claim, and a powerful element of her political impact, was her unwavering assertion of her virginity. In a deeply religious and patriarchal society, Joan's purity became a symbol of her divine inspiration and a key to her acceptance as a leader. France, in the early 15th century, was in a desperate state. Large parts of the country were occupied by the English and their Burgundian allies. The French court was divided, and the Dauphin Charles was hesitant and lacked the resources and confidence to reclaim his kingdom. Into this bleak scenario stepped Joan, a young woman with no military training or noble background, yet filled with an unshakable conviction. When Joan first presented herself to local commanders and then to the Dauphin's court, she was met with skepticism and suspicion. A young woman claiming to hear saints and wanting to lead an army was unheard of. One of the first things the theologians and court officials did was to examine her. This examination included verifying her virginity. In the medieval mindset, virginity was often associated with holiness, purity, and a special closeness to God. For Joan, it was a crucial validation of her claims. If she was found to be a virgin, it lent credibility to her assertion that she was a messenger from God, not a sorceress or a deceiver. Her purity was, in effect, her first political credential. Once her virginity was attested to, and after she impressed the Dauphin with her sincerity and knowledge, perhaps of military matters or prophecies, she was given a chance. Dressed in white armor, carrying a banner, she was sent to the besieged city of Orleans. Her arrival electrified the demoralized French troops and the citizens of Orleans. She inspired them with her courage, her piety, and her unwavering belief in victory. Under her inspiration, if not direct tactical command, the French broke the siege of Orleans in a stunning victory. This was a major turning point in the war. Joan's continued insistence on her status as the maid, la pucelle, a term emphasizing her virginity, was central to her image and her influence. It reinforced the idea that she was divinely protected and guided. Her soldiers, many of whom were rough veterans, revered her. Her purity set her apart, giving her a unique moral authority. This was incredibly important politically. It helped unite factions, inspire loyalty, and rally a nation that was on the brink of collapse. She became a powerful symbol of French resistance and divine favor. Her singleness was an intrinsic part of this. Marriage would have immediately changed her status, placing her under the authority of a husband and making her claims of a unique divine mission harder to sustain in the eyes of the public and the court. Her celibate, dedicated state was seen as fitting for someone chosen by God for such an extraordinary task. After Orléans, Joan led the French army to several more victories, clearing the way for the Dauphin to travel to Reims, the traditional site of French coronations. Her presence at his coronation as King Charles VII was the fulfillment of a key part of her mission. However, her fortune soon changed. She was captured by Burgundian forces in 1430 and sold to the English. The English and their French collaborators were determined to discredit Joan and, by extension, King Charles VII, whose legitimacy she had helped establish. They put her on trial for heresy and witchcraft. Again, her character and her claims of divine guidance were scrutinized. Her virginity, which had been a source of her strength, was implicitly challenged by accusations that her voices were demonic, not divine. The trial was a deeply political affair, aimed at destroying her reputation and undermining the French cause. She was ultimately condemned largely for wearing male attire, which she said she wore for protection in prison and because her voices commanded it, and for refusing to renounce her voices. In 1431, at the age of about 19, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in Rouen. Even in death, her story and her image, including the Maid, continued to be politically potent. Years later, King Charles VII ordered a retrial which nullified her conviction and declared her a martyr. She became a symbol of French nationalism and, much later, a saint of the Catholic Church. Joan of Arc's choice to remain single and her emphasis on her virginity were not just personal details. They were integral to her political identity and her ability to inspire a nation. Her purity was her banner, under which she led armies and changed the course of history. Number 1. The Queen who ruled alone, her singleness a sword and shield for her kingdom. In the history books, she's often called the Virgin Queen. Queen Elizabeth I of England, who reigned from 1558 to 1603, turned her unmarried status into one of the most powerful political tools any monarch has ever wielded. In an age when queens were expected to marry, produce heirs, and often defer to their husbands, Elizabeth's lifelong singleness was a radical and masterfully played political statement. It shaped England's foreign policy, secured her own authority, and became a cornerstone of her legendary rule. Elizabeth came to the throne in a precarious situation. England was religiously divided between Protestants and Catholics, financially strained, and faced threats from powerful European neighbors like Spain and France. As a young unmarried queen, the pressure on her to marry was enormous and immediate. Her counselors, parliament, and foreign rulers all expected her to choose a husband quickly. A royal marriage could secure alliances, provide a king to help her rule, as many believed a woman could not rule alone effectively, and, most importantly, produce an heir to prevent a succession crisis. And suitors there were, aplenty. King Philip II of Spain, her former brother-in-law, archdukes from Austria, French princes like the Duke of Anjou, Swedish royalty, and English noblemen like Robert Dudley, all were at various times considered potential husbands for Elizabeth. Each potential match was fraught with political implications. Marrying a foreign Catholic prince could anger her Protestant subjects and drag England into European conflicts. Marrying a Protestant foreigner might alienate Catholic powers. Marrying an English nobleman could create jealousy and factionalism among her own court. Elizabeth, with incredible political skill, played this marriage game for decades. She engaged in prolonged negotiations with various suitors, hinting at the possibility of marriage, using it as a diplomatic bargaining chip to keep potential enemies off balance or to secure favorable terms in treaties. She kept Europe guessing. This courtship diplomacy allowed her to navigate treacherous international waters without committing England to costly alliances or submitting her realm or herself to foreign influence. Her famous indecisiveness about marriage was in reality often a deliberate strategy. Internally, by not marrying, Elizabeth retained her supreme authority. Any husband, especially a foreign king, might have tried to assert control over English policy or even claim the throne for himself. By remaining single, Elizabeth ensured that she, and she alone, was the ultimate decision-maker. She famously declared to Parliament that she was already bound unto a husband, which is the Kingdom of England. This powerful imagery cast her as a monarch devoted solely to her people, her singleness a testament to her dedication. She cultivated the image of the Virgin Queen, a ruler whose purity and devotion were to her nation. This persona inspired loyalty and a kind of romantic, chivalric devotion from her subjects, particularly as she aged. Poets and playwrights celebrated her in this guise. Of course, her choice not to marry was not without risks. The biggest was the succession. Without a direct heir, there was always the danger of civil war or foreign intervention upon her death. This was a constant source of anxiety for her advisors and her people throughout her long reign. Yet Elizabeth consistently prioritized her own control and England's immediate stability and independence over settling the succession through marriage. She managed to maintain peace and foster a period of great cultural and economic flourishing known as the Elizabethan Age. Despite this lingering uncertainty, her speeches to Parliament often addressed her unmarried state directly. She would artfully thank them for their concern for her marriage and the succession, while subtly reasserting her own judgment and her commitment to England's welfare above all else. She made it clear that her personal life was subordinate to her political responsibilities, and her choice to remain single was a central part of how she fulfilled those responsibilities. Queen Elizabeth I's decision to never marry was perhaps the most defining political statement of her reign. It was a bold assertion of female sovereignty in a male-dominated world. It allowed her to maintain England's independence, control her own government, and cultivate a powerful cult of personality that united her people. She demonstrated that a woman could rule effectively and successfully on her own terms, using her singleness not as a weakness, but as her greatest strength, a shield to protect her kingdom and a sword to command its destiny. Her reign proved that a queen's power did not have to come from a king beside her on the throne.